Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Zed Lopez. This is What the Glulx, the Inform Tech Stack. And Andrew may refuse to pronounce it, but I caught him on video saying Glulx. Now, first, it's great to finally see you all in person. And if my name means anything to you, then you probably know me better as a cartoon character banging on a keyboard. Or maybe you subscribed to the Inform 7 tips. So I've had my own technical difficulties, so I'm just adjusting. I hope you'll indulge me in briefly describing my own Inform journey. I've been into IF from the beginning. On a visit to my father's workplace in 77 or 78, a coworker of his said there was a game on the computer I should try. And it was Colossal Cave. And at the time, I thought it was the coolest thing ever, and part of me still does. Now, as a computer science major in the 80s, I had fantasies that I didn't really expect to happen. Being an Infocom implementer, but I didn't know how unlikely that would be because my education outlasted it. Now, I was on the fringe of the IF community for a long time. I read some Red Arts in fiction some of the time when it was going concern. I meant to get around to learning Inform 6 sometime. I played some IF comp games, and I heard of Inform 7 when it was released, and I even poked at it a little bit a few times. I read Aaron Reed's book, and I got to where I could kind of credibly say I knew how to code in Inform 7. My very first post to the InFiction forums was in July 2011, and I was proposing a scheme for how to do NetHack style scrolls, and some code vaguely resembling this made it into perk. But I have to admit, I still felt like I didn't get it. Now I wouldn't be talking to you today if outside of some extreme circumstances. In the fall of 2020, I left my marriage and moved into a small single apartment without so much as a cat at the time. So I was extra isolated in the days of social isolation. I realized I had two choices. I could find a project or crack. So early in 2021, I thought of Inform 7. And I decided I had flirted with it long enough. It was time to consummate the relationship. How hard could it be after all? I mean, I'm an experienced programmer. We're talking about a system literally made to imitate games and, to look and behave like games from 40 years ago. Exhibit A, Enchanted. Exhibit B, 40 years later, Never Give Up Your Dead. Look pretty close. But then I started to look into what were some of the pieces involved in the various parts of the Inform technical stack. For instance, I came across this. GLK meets Inscription. It greatly uses the GLK API or been adapted, takes some of those, compiles them to use the random GLK library using Inscription, and then outputs to JavaScript and WebAssembly. Okay, now that is a project of Danny Wilson's. I absolutely do not mean to bust on Danny. Danny's doing hard things of making a whole lot of different moving parts interact. So of course, a brief description is going to seem confusing to someone who doesn't yet know what those pieces are. So, our story begins, well, a lot of the technical stack depends on details of history. So I have to provide some history to start talking about it. So our tale begins some decades ago with a British graduate student in mathematics of such surpassing genius that his work would literally shape the course of history. I think you all know who I'm talking about. Alan Turing. In 1936, he published on computable numbers with an application to the Unscheduled problem. And that means decidability problem, as it's called in English. Now, part of what Turing does in this paper is to describe an abstract machine. This little excerpt right here, talks about if computer can down by a machine. And he describes, what such a machine might be. Now, starts with some definitions. The machine has some finite alphabet of symbols. There is a so-called register, which is a special piece of memory which holds one symbol. Now, its memory is considered to be a tape infinitely extending to both the left and the right, and a pointer to a particular location in that tape. Now, the tape is both the machine's memory and its input and output. Whatever input it has exists on the tape at the beginning, and whatever output it creates is something it writes to the tape. So it's not the most user-friendly of things, but it gets the job done. Now, then there's a table of instructions, which includes what symbols to write to the register, based on what symbol we're pointing at, and what's in the register. The table of instructions says, what symbol do we write to the register, what symbol do we write to the current tape location, and whether to move the pointer left or right. Now, it'd be very understandable if we were listening to this and wondering, so when are the definitions going to end, and where's the actual talking computer going to get here? But if you study computer science, you know the punchline, which is, that's it. That is the computer. That's all it takes. And an enormous part of the foundation of computer science is the Church-Turing thesis, which, very vaguely paraphrased, says that anything we can describe in an algorithm, anything that is potentially computable, can be computed by a Turing machine. That's an interpretation of the thesis. But because that is true, if we want to prove that some given system can solve some given problem, well, can we implement a Turing machine in that system? Because if we can implement a Turing machine in that system, we know that a Turing machine can solve that problem. So we have thus demonstrated that the system can solve that problem. So a decade before a general purpose digital computer existed, Alan Turing had created virtual machines. And he didn't call them these in his paper, but they're universally known as Turing machines now. Okay. Nothing interesting happened for another 40 years. But then things started happening very quickly. In 1976, Will Crowther gave his coworkers access to this program he'd written for fun on his downtime from his day job for inventing the internet. And it was just to entertain his daughters. And so he gave them access to it, he left on vacation, and they helpfully distributed it on the ARPANET, what then was the internet, without his permission. And so it thus reached dozens or hundreds of people, the net being very small then. One of the people it reached was Don Woods at Stanford. He became the first spammer in history because he didn't know how to get in touch with Crowther. There was the only information in the program was send bugs reports to Crowther. So he mailed Crowther at every domain on the internet, and isn't remembered as a villain because the net was very small. So he expanded. He contacted Crowther. He got the source code and permission to expand it. He wrote the 350-point version of Adventure that probably many of us have played. And in 1977, the summer of 1977, that was released. And some of the people playing it were some employees, some MIT alumni working at the MIT AI lab, who were very excited about it. They thought they wanted to do something like that with a better person. And before the end of 1977, people were running the first version of Zork. The logo will come later. Something else important happened in 1977. Computers. This time it's personal. The Zork implementers started thinking, hey, it would be nice to sell Zork for microcomputers. They were up against some pretty tough problems, though. Namely, they had written Zork on a machine that was much bigger than PCs in every way. So they were up against the fact that personal computers were tiny, with as little as 32K of memory. To put that into perspective, if you were to fill all of 32K with text, you'd only get some, a little more than a short story if you're using plain text. Now, the other thing they're up against is new PC brands kept popping up, and it was just not feasible to try to personalize code for each adventure for each PC brand, especially since nobody knew which brands were going to have any staying power. And you wouldn't want to invest a lot of time in something that went out of business the next week. So they came up with a clever scheme. They designed a virtual machine, a Z machine, let's say, and they create a language that would compile to Z code. So that way, they only need to write the one compiler to compile their actual interactive fiction to, a Z code binary. And then per computer platform they wanted to sell for, they just needed to write one thing that would interpret the Z code file. And handle like little details like input, output, and display. Now, I just referred to compilation. Compilation, most broadly, is translating one sequence of symbols into another by a set of rules. So, input, a miracle occurs, output. At the heart of every computer, there is a CPU, central processing unit. What does this central unit process? Instructions, mostly very simple ones, called opcodes. Short for operation code. Now suppose we have this simple algorithm like this. We're going to multiply x and y, and assign it to z. If z is greater than 100, we're going to add 1 to x. Otherwise, we're going to subtract 2 from y. This happens to be working Python code, but that's not important to the example. The above, once it's going to end up looking something more like this. What we see down the left-hand column here is mul, jg, add, jump, sub. Those are the opcodes. So they're extremely low-level and simple. So we multiply x and y, and we assign it to z. Now, this one's a little complicated because it's acting on if z is not greater than 100, we jump to L over 1, i.e. subtracting 2 from y, which was the else clause. And otherwise, we just continue to the then clause, adding 1 to x, and assigning it back to x, and we jump past the else clause. But as rough as this looks to read, that's actually much, much better than what it really looks like, because all of those, what I was just showing you is what's called assembly language, which is a language that is ultimately meant to be comprehensible to a human with enough work. And people do sometimes write in it directly, but it is at a very low level, at a level at which there's a one-to-one correspondence between things you're doing and the features of the CPU itself. So, let's say, for instance, that up top is a table of correspondences of what the numeric values corresponding to these outcodes are. And what it really exists in a computer is just this sequence of numbers, 118, 1, 2, 3. In this case, the 1, 2, 3, those are our x, y, and z because those are our only variables. Those are offsets from their variable storage begins. The first one is at the beginning plus 1, at the beginning plus 2, 3 plus 3. And it's the same logic we had before, just much harder for a human to code with. So, this is, like I said, people sometimes do write in this, and a program called an assembler that translates assembly language into the what's called binary or executable, typically, that the CPU can actually process directly. I promise there's not going to be anything more that's anywhere near this hairy. Now, early on, Inform, for publicity, published some articles on what their scheme was. there was in a 1979 issue, April 1979 issue of Computer, one of the IEEE journals, was Zork, a computerized fantasy simulation game. In creative computing was outfit a large programmer to a small machine. Raise your hand if you had that issue of creative computing. In Byte was Zork in the future of computerized fantasy simulations. I guess they hadn't quite come up with the term interactive fiction yet. Now, so people knew that this was the scheme they adopted, and from early on, there were people trying to reverse engineer the Z machine and how it worked. And, it was, for instance, a great day in the programming world when you hear about clever schemes. You're always wondering just how much does the reality line up with this clever scheme versus what was shaved off the edges as it went. But people found out, to their great excitement, that it really was the case, that you could find the same binary blob in a Commodore version of an Infocom game and in the Apple version. And I'm going to make a long story very, very, very short. A group of Australian hackers who called themselves the Info Task Force, they succeeded. They stared at those binaries and analyzed it long enough that they understood the Z machine well enough to write the first interpreter independent of Infocom. A programmer named Mark Powell wrote an early interpreter called Zip, and as well he wrote a disassembler for it, i.e. something that would take it from the binary to the ugly but semi-readable thing featuring opcodes like mall. Also, Infocom died. Now, our story finally brings us to another brilliant British mathematics grad student. Graham Nelson was aware of and had aware of the others' work and had their code. And he took the step that no one had tried previously. He wrote a Z-code assembler and became the first person since Infocom to actually create a working Z-code binary. That assembler evolved into the initial version of Inform, which he used to write the first Inform game, Curses. The IF archive actually already existed as an FTP site in those days, and Graham on the same day released Inform as open source by uploading it to the archive and posting about it to records in fiction, and uploaded the first Inform game, Curses, and posted about it to rec games in fiction. And then he heard nothing for days. He was left thinking that, well, suppose I was putting a lot of work into kind of a dead medium here. His Usenet feed was broken. When he got it fixed, he found out that there was actually a lot of excitement around having a big, high-quality game reminiscent of Infocom. A couple of years later, Graham did another very important thing. He wrote a thorough specification for the Z machine. Now, before that, people were struggling, reading source code to try to figure out how things worked. But he created this thorough spec, and now writing one's own interpreter became basically a reasonable hobby project for a programmer, and that this is why one gets written for practically every new language and platform that comes along. So there are a lot of them. Why there's Fismo, Filter, Frotzen, Providence, Folly, IFDM, Nipple, Newscope, Losmo, Warble, Waffle, Osmo, Vezop, Yola, M4, ZBM, MCMPP, Zip, Zimu, Zoom, Zax, Sword, Mid, ZXD. These are not the only ones that you can download from my F archive. So if you want some more, then you'll just have to do a deeper dive. I promise. No more singing. Now, Inform continued to evolve. Infocom had used 6 versions of the Z machine. The spec accounts for the differences among them. And in the final versions that Infocom worked with, P5 and P6, story files could be up to 256K. Graham tweaked things and created 2 new formats, V7, which never got much use because once V8 was out, there wasn't really any reason to use V7. But V7 and V8 could go up to 512K. But that was actually a ceiling that was starting to feel primary. Now, when we talk about Inform 6, sometimes we mean the language, and sometimes we mean compiler. And if you look at the designer's manual, version 4 for Inform 6, what's always called DM4, it also talks a lot about the Inform 6 standard library. Now, the standard library is not a part of the compiler, and in fact, many people now are writing using puny Inform as a library instead. Not using the standard library at all. Also, the standard library has been separated as a project. The Inform 6 compiler and the standard library are maintained by different people. Now, Andrew Plotkin had ported Mark Howell's interpreter Zip to the X Window system, and also for the Macintosh, and wrote a task client for the Mac. And taking a long view, Andrew figured that text-based IF had similar needs. If we had an input-output library that could broadly serve text games needs, multiple game development systems could write their interpreters to work with that library, and then kind of just like how Infocom's strategy for all they have to do is write an interpreter once per platform. All somebody has to do is port the GLK library once per platform, and then all the different platforms made to work with GLK become easy to port. So, yeah, I've been, even though it's not capitalized, it's like an acronym, I always read this as GLK. I know now that Andrew says Glulx, but I'm kind of have GLK stuck in my mind, so I hope Andrew isn't wincing, but that's what I'm going to continue to call it. So, let's at last do what the Glulx. This title has actually existed for 3 years. I found the beginnings of an essay trying to describe the things I'm describing now from March 21. The Glulx, well, just like the early Infocom people designed a virtual machine, Andrew designed a new virtual machine. But this one had 32-bit addressing, which means it can handle story files up to 4 gigabytes. And to give you an idea of what that means, you could comfortably fit around 10,000 very short novels or 6,000 more typical ones, uncompressed in that much space. So essentially, we don't expect anyone to ever hit that limit with a text-centered game. The machine is called Glulx. The standard compiler, the reference compiler for the Glulx machine is called Glulx. At least, I don't know if it's supposed to be pronounced differently, but I pronounce them the same. But fortunately, something to clear things up much more is there is an alternative compiler called Git. Now, this used to be simplifying, but then some upstart named Torvalds wrote a source control system called Git that took over the world. And if you try to web search for Git, you're going to need to add a few more terms if you want to find the one that is a global interpreter. Okay, so Inform 6 was modified so that it could compile to either of the Z machine or Glulx. What are the differences? I'm going to hit the highlights. Numbers. The Z machine can only count between, in this range, pretty small range. Glulx has a bigger range. And further, Glulx has floating point numbers. Glulx, since it's always JLK, when Andrew designed it, he already had in mind that it was going to be the input-output library for the successor VM to the Z machine. So it can handle images, sounds, external files. Well, maybe. If you look at the details, it's permissible to write a Glulx interpreter that can't handle these things, and it's up to the programmer to test that a given feature exists in the current running interpreter and take appropriate action. Now, the character sets they can handle. The Z machine, I'm going to oversimplify and just say Latin 1. It's not, the answer is a little more complicated and a little more limited than that, but it can handle ASCII and some non-ASCII. Glulx, at least as of the forthcoming version, for which there is not yet a release date, can handle all of Unicode. It uses UTF-32 and can handle any character. Doesn't mean, of course, that a given user is going to have a font that handles that character. So right now we're hearing all about the advantage of Glulx, but the Z machine actually has a few tricks that Glulx does not. The box quotations that everyone liked in Trinity, where the there's a pop-up window on top of other existing text that then disappears. The Z machine can handle that. GLK and thus Glulx cannot. There's nothing stopping you from creating a text grid window and doing the centering manually, but there isn't a concept of overlap. And then the Z machine can vary colors on a per character basis in the same line. It's a little more flexible with color variation options for styling text. Now, we use the word interpreter in a couple of different ways. There's the actual thing that is interpreting the source code, the binary code rather. For Z machines, there's these and the whole thing I said before. And then there are essentially Glulx, Git, and kicks. I don't know if it's supposed to be kicks or quicks. The JavaScript interpreter for Glulx. But when players, and rather than programmers, talk about interpreters, they're often thinking of the multi-interpreter applications like Spatterlight, Parchment, Gargoyle, or Electro, which Electro is based on kicks, but Gargoyle, Parchment, Spatterlight, all of them, I think, ship with all of your choice of Glulx or Git. And there is a detail worth knowing is that for all four of these, thus for the ways most players are likely to play your game, and unless you're writing targeting Osmu and it's supposed to be run directly in a Z code interpreter. These don't actually implement the Z machine IO layer as it's written. They're faking it with GLK, thus they inherit GLK's limits and abilities, which means that box quotations are going to look bad in whole. When Inform, when it tries to do a box quotation and it doesn't have the support for it, basically just prints the text. No attempt at formatting, no attempt at centering. Now, it's also worth knowing, and this is actually unfortunately a little obscure, all of these, except for kicks, have implemented a set of GLK extensions that I suppose originated in Gargoyle, at least that's how they get named. And they can do color more like the Z machine. So that's true of Spatterlight, Gargoyle, and Parchment. Parchment is the thing used by PlayIF, thus the thing used by Play Online for a lot of games in the IFTV. But Electro and kicks do not. Now, I'm running short on time, so I'm going to quickly mention some other important things. The Z machine spec doesn't say anything about how a save game is supposed to be written. And in fact, the Z machine is a very weird virtual machine because it has opcodes as complicated as save game, load game, where the client is doing log work. And this is where my slide deck breaks. There is a standard called Quetzal, which is a portable standard for save file games that actually let you actually save game longer and load it in a. Another important standard is Blorb, which you've all doubtless heard of, and because that's what when you release, build, and inform. But it makes a Blorb file that will can, for instance, wrap it with a cover image, which is frequently all people use it for, but it can do arbitrary files. If this were being done today and we weren't trying to target small machines, I suspect people would just use a zip file in place of Blorb, but zip would be too hefty for some of the things that Z machines run on to try to unpack. And then finally, the last thing I'll try to squeeze in, because we're about out of time, is the Treaty of Babel. Was Tad's creator and four people and other systems of the day agreed on a single standard for IFIDs, which has been a great boon for being able to track and find things and to index things in an IFD. And how much, is there any wiggle room? How many minutes do I have left if someone can let me know?
You've got about 10 minutes if you want to ask questions or take some questions.
Well, I will make one last point and then take questions, which is that probably everyone's familiar with the story about how basically all of Europe built axles the same length because they were trying to fit in the same roads that had been the standard for Roman chariots, and that would ultimately become the width of railroad gauge. And so, look, the railroad gauge goes back, about 2,000 years. Now, this is nonsense. People made axles about the same length because two horses side by side are about the same width. And for many decades, there wasn't a standard railroad gauge. There's a story that the person who settled on the gauge that eventually became standard took some inspiration from the width of a Roman road, but that's about it. However, with when Graham wrote Inform 7, he had a lot of work. Inform 7 was a lot of work. He didn't want to reproduce work he'd already done, so Inform 7 reused a huge amount of the i6 standard library. And that's true to this day. It used to be called the Inform 6 template layer. In version 10, it's called kits. And the parser has a huge amount in common with the Inform 6 parser. Lots of things about the world model does. So, and the things that are in the standard library are, based on, the world model that was created by Infocom. So we really are, actually, we have the echo of 40-year-old technology affecting us today. And with that, are there any questions?
Thank you very much.
You bet.